In this video, I'd like to show the process, the steps, the tools, the methods, and some of the thinking that goes into replicating a piece of molding, in this case a piece of ranch casing, to make new pieces to match for a remodeling project. The quantity I need is pretty limited. I've got 9 8-footers here, which is plenty to do the job. The steps are a little bit involved, but it's still not worth the cost of having a molding knife made to cut this all in one pass. In this video I'll show the steps I used to take this from a 1x10 board down to this exact replica of a piece of ranch casing. For our current project, I need to make 8 pieces of this ranch profile, 8 feet long, to retrim a couple new doors. To line up the radiuses and profiles in various dimensions of the molding to replicate it, I'll cut a nice clean straight piece out of the middle so that I have a definite profile and shape to match. A close-up of this molding shows the essential parts to matching it. You can have a width, a thickness on the fat edge, a thickness on the thin edge, and then the angle of this taper will be critical to get a good match. And the essential step into getting a good profile match for this particular molding is going to be to get a nice flat milled face with this bevel or angle built into it. To get a good replication of a molding, it's always essential to plan out ahead all the various operations that it's going to take and get them in the right sequence. By taking a close look at the trim I'm trying to match, I determined the type of pine. I believe this is a ponderosa pine rather than a spruce that this original molding was made out of. I found 3 1x10s at the local lumberyard, which will do a good job of matching for the grain texture and color. And I'll be able to get 3 sticks of molding out of each of these pieces, so I'll end up with 9 8-footers. So the first step of the milling process is to rough out the blanks from these pieces by straightening the edge and then ripping them on a table saw. I make sure there's extra width and thickness on the roughed out pieces so that they can be flat, straight, and consistently thick by the time I proceed with the milling steps. I'll visually check out each piece and determine what's the optimum way to cut the board to eliminate bark and knots and bad edges. And I'll begin by straightening one edge. A couple passes on the Powermatic PJ882 and that edge is as straight as an arrow. This board's got a pretty decent cup to it, but I'm not going to worry about it at this point until I've cut the strips, and I'll flatten those. I always make sure to look over any of the surfaces that are going to run through my power tools and get rid of staples or rocks or nails that might be hiding there. Putty knife will lift those staples out. Sometimes rocks are embedded there and a sharp putty knife will knock those loose too. This board has a loose knot in the edge and I don't want that flying off in my face, because not even safety goggles will make that feel good. Get those cleaned up good so they don't nick or chip a knife on any of the cutting tools. I'm going to set my rib blade so the teeth are just an 1/8 inch above the thickness of the board. I've got the board laying cup side down so it's steady as it goes through. I'm only going to get 3 pieces out of this, no matter how careful I am. And we need to have a little extra for the saw curves, and there's not quite enough, so I don't have to be too stingy on the cuts. I'm just going to rip these at 2.5 inches and I'll mill them down later. To work around this knot and make sure it doesn't end up in my molding, I'm going to take 2 passes. First I'm going to rip that knot off, and then I'll make my 2.5 inch width so that the blank for the trim will come out in between the knot that's cut off and the knots that's missing. The next step I do is to clean up both faces of the wood with a sharp cutting knife. Some small pieces of grit embedded down into this face. And scratch those out of there so that they don't nick my planer knives. With a sharp putty knife, the rock stroke is a real faint click. And then I mark each face with a pencil line to keep track of them. With all 18 faces scraped clean and marked for milling, the next step will be to flatten one face of each piece. Tracing the profile of the molding on the end of one of the blanks will give me an idea of how much wood needs to come off and how much material I can spare to get the wood straight and flat. In this case I've got barely a 1/16 of an inch that I can mill off of here to get these pieces flat. I'll set the joiner at just under a 1/16 of an inch so they can take a nice full pass on each of these pieces and get them flat. As the pieces come out of the joiner, I'll put the straight flat side down, and this pencil mark reminds me, if the pieces get knocked around, the pencil mark reminds me which is the piece that still needs to be planed. So these pieces are flat side down, wavy side up. And I'll go through the whole stack and get them to this stage. The next step in this process is to run these blanks through a thickness planer so that I have 2 flat parallel edges. I'm going to mic this, and this is just under 11/16, a fat 5/8 of an inch. So I'm going to go a strong 11/16 of an inch with the setting on the thickness planer. This is the loudest machine in the shop, so I'm going to put on earphones, and for you, I'll turn down the volume. I can see from my pencil marks that only 3 of the boards out of this batch got cleaned up all the way on their first pass. It's going to be cutting it close, but I'm going to have to take another pass to get these other boards cleaned up. You can see here how much I have to spare. There's still another 1/16 of an inch to go, so I'm going to take a 32nd and see where that gets it. Half a turn on this DeWalt planer is a 32nd of an inch. You can see at this stage of the game how important the pencil marks are. They tell me where the dips and bumps are in the board. When the pencil mark is gone, then I've got a true surface on the board. And I need to keep sneaking up on that thickness until all the pencil marks are gone so that all the boards are clean. Sometimes it's amazing how much difference a 32nd of an inch can make. Each one of these boards cleaned up nicely, except for one. I got a low spot in this one board, but that'll be easy. I can just make that the back of the molding and everything will be fine. I still have enough thickness left over here for one final pass, but it's going to be close. Now that all the boards are flat and smooth on both sides, the next step is to straighten the best edge. For this step, I've moved the guard over so that the amount of the cutter head that's actually exposed is just barely over the thickness of the board. And I'm selecting the best edge of the board. In this case, I'll straighten this edge, and when I trim it, we'll lose some of this bark. As the pieces come from the joiner, I'm careful to stack all the jointed straight edges on the right so that when I move the pieces over to be ripped for width, the straight edge is along the fence. But you're getting closer to having the blank the correct size, and this process will true up the width. As each piece is ripped, the unevenness in width comes off in the scrap, leaving a blank of the exact same dimension. When they come out of the table saw, I'll stand them with the saw blade side up in a pile. I can reduce the height of the blade since we've thinned the boards down. I'm going to set this, now that we have a straight edge on the blanks, I'm going to leave a fat 1/16 of an extra width so that we can run it through the thickness planer for the final width. With these blanks all ripped to the same width and the saw cut edge up, the plain edge down, I'll just mark this edge. In case something gets mixed up in the planing process. Now I'll run them through the thickness planer and take about a 32nd of an inch off of this side, flip everything over and take a 32nd off the other side to end up at our finished width. And have two planar milled surfaces on each edge. That way I barely have to sand it when it's done. When feeding boards like this into the planer, I stagger the ends so that the feed roller catches the first board, and if I get any snipe at all, it'll just be on the very beginning of the longest one. And that's why I put the marks on there. When a board drops, it's easy to know which way it goes for the milling process. When one pass is made on one edge of all the pieces, increase the thickness and then flip each pile end for end, top for bottom, to plane the other side. Caliper is telling me that these are exactly 2 3/16. Blanks at this point are 2 3/16 strong. I've got about a 1/64 of an inch to take off on this edge to clean off the joiner marks and put a nice mill finish on it. Now that all these pieces are consistent thickness and width, it's time to go through and determine which orientation we're going to cut the finished piece out of. And at this point I'll make sure that any knots or defects that remain in the trim, I think there's a couple nicks here and there, I'll make sure that they get cut away when we do this bevel process. But I'm going to mark each of these pieces and line them up so that we can cut a rough bevel for this face. All the pieces are marked and oriented the way you want the bevel and the face to be cut. The only real issue that had to be cut around was this one thin spot that didn't come out in the thickness planer, but I'm putting that on the thin edge of the bevel so that'll get cut off nicely, and this little hint of bark here will round off with a router bit at the end. There's all sorts of fancy angle gauges and sophisticated methods of figuring out that angle, but I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way. Just raise the blade up enough where it'll cut through the blank, and just tilt the blade over till it looks right. By sighting through the angle of the blade, I'm going to leave a little bit of space in there because the final pass for this face is going to be the thickness planer, not a sander. And that looks like it is about an 8-degree angle after all. I have all the blanks stacked and oriented so that the bevel will be cut off on the face. You don't have to think about that in the heat of the moment, which is going to get cut when and where. I'm going to put away my 3/4 inch thick push stick in favor of a 1/4 inch one that will follow nicely behind the blade here. Keep all that safe, and then make the first pass on one of the short pieces to confirm the setup. Taking off just a whisker there, but between that scrap and the saw kerf, it's a fair amount of wood that's removed. So what I'm left with is just a skinny 1/16 of an inch to take off in the final pass in the thickness planer. I'm happy with that setup. I'm going to get these pieces cut. Over the years, I've come to dislike sanding a great deal. So I go to extra lengths to avoid it. One of the best ways I've found to avoid very much sanding is to make the final pass on a piece of millwork either with a thickness planer or a router. That way the mill marks are small, close together, very smooth, and it just takes a wipe with the sandpaper to get a perfect finished product. I mentioned making custom millwork requires creativity, and this is the point where a little creativity is going to be required. Since I want to use a thickness planer for this final surface, for the final pass on this surface, and the thickness planer only does parallel lines, I need to get a bevel. So to be creative here, I trued up a regular old 2x4, all 6 sides flat, true, and smooth and straight. And I'm going to make a sled for the thickness planer that will hold our blanks at the right angle so that the thickness planer makes one final pass to remove the saw marks and set the bevel of our piece of ranch casing. I'm just going to carefully trace the angle of the face of this casing. I'm going to put a reference mark here on the edge. After a little trial and error on the table saw, that angle turns out to be just slightly under 9 degrees. We made this rough cut at 8 degrees, but that's okay. This pass through the thickness planer will true that up. So I got the angle good. I'm going to flip this around and give us a little mark here. I'm liking the looks of that fit. If you look closely, you can see that I overcut this saw kerf to leave a little space underneath there, so if any sawdust gets in there, it won't push the molding out of its orientation. But this edge will still easily guide the blanks through the thickness planer. The other thing is that this notch is in the low point, so pressure from the feed rollers will only force the blank down into that corner for a nice true milling process. I'll put a generous coat of paste wax on this fixture to help the blank slide through more smoothly, and then attach this to another sheet of plywood to hold it in position in the thickness planer. So here's how the sled fits in the thickness planer. What I have is a piece of MDF. It's nice and true and squared flat, and I positioned our carriage for the stock so that I can lay the pieces on here and feed them into the thickness planer. And there's a little bit of sled sticking out the back side of the thickness planer. and this is just screwed on through the bottom, and then I screwed this cleat on the end to keep the whole fixture from being pulled through the thickness planer. This block is spaced from the edge so that the piece is comfortably under the knife. The cleat is big enough that I can throw a clamp on it just to kind of keep that in place during the milling process. I did a final test of the bevel angle by laying the trim piece on here and checking both edges with the caliper. Just under 1.5" on both sides. That's within a 256th of an inch. I'm going to call that good enough. So now when our pieces run through here, we'll slide through, and the thickness planer on the slow speed will put a beautiful finish on the face of those blanks. Alright, well, it's showtime. And the way I dial this thickness in is I raise the cutter head up enough so that the piece just slides through. I'll fire up the thickness planer, lower the head until it picks up the piece, starts cutting and pulls it through. I'll tweak it down just another 1/8 of a turn or so to make our final pass. I can put some pencil marks on here just to monitor the process. And what I'd like to do is to mill this down in 2 passes, one of a heavy 32nd, one of a light 64th, to really polish that up. So that's what you're going to see happen here when the noise starts. Alright, what I ended up doing was sneaking up on this in a few passes. I'm liking the way this comes out. I think I'm going to do it all in one pass. I'll switch this to the slow setting. The speed can only be changed when the machine is running. I'm happy with that. If this was a hardwood, or if I'd left a little more material on here after that, after the rough cut, might need to take it in 2 passes or change something up a little bit, but this is going to be a one-step process and works just fine. I'm really liking the way that the milling's going on these boards. Cut off all the defects in the milling process, and we got our blank to perfectly match this existing piece of trim with a beautiful smooth finish on there. This is 179 cuts per inch. Let's see, maybe we should count them. 1, 2, 3. No, I give up. The next step in the process for replicating this piece of casing is going to be to round these 2 edges. Just by trial and error, seeing that a 1/16 of an inch radius or an 1/8 inch round over bit is going to fit that curve nicely. There's a little creativity involved at this step also, because the router bit is designed to work on a square corner, 90-degree corner, and by trying to make this bit fit here, the radius is either going to be incomplete or it's going to dig in. So to compensate for that, on the high side here, I have the scrap that I cut off while making the fixture for planing this surface. I'm just going to attach a little piece of that with double stick tape to the bottom of my router, and that'll provide a 90-degree surface for indexing the router bit. Fastcat makes this ridiculously good double stick tape, and I'm thinking it'll be good enough for this application. I'll just do it this way. You can always drop the router bit down a little bit to get the flushness setting I'm after. With a little trial and error between setting the height of the router bit and testing it out on this piece, I've come up with the perfect height combination to match this radius perfectly to the existing molding. Now it's a matter of running this profile on the right corner of all these blanks with a nice consistent feed rate to get a smooth finish. It's going to be pretty sweet. The next step in the process is going to be to put the radius on the low side of this molding, and it's a little trickier because it's an obtuse angle and not an acute angle. So the router bit just isn't going to fit in there no matter what we do. Because I wasn't satisfied with the result I was going to get by using that 1/8 inch roundover bit in the router to get the rounded profile on this thin edge of the casing, I took a few minutes and set the bit up in the router table with the bearing off, and so I'm able to get the finished product in one quick pass. The error is only a couple thousandths of an inch, but if I were to stain that without sanding it off, that little lip would show. For the final step, to put the relief in the back of the molding, make installation easier, got a dado blade set up, about a 3/4 inch width, about a 1/16 of an inch deep. I'll make a couple passes in the back to put the relief cuts in. After running that first pass on all the pieces, I'll shift the fence over to widen this out. Looks like moving the fence over a 1/2 inch will get it done. I've always liked the saying, it takes a lot to be good and just a little bit more to be the best. And with that thought in mind, I decided to make one final setup with the table saw blade set up at a 45-degree angle, and that is to change this 90-degree dado made on with the dado blade to a beveled out, finished look. All it takes is a couple quick passes on the table saw to give a professional look. Well, there you have it, the steps and tools that I used to replicate this piece of ranch casing from start to finish. These pieces are just ready for a quick light sanding and some stain. and a coat of finish, and they'll be ready to install. With the millwork magic complete, a little bit of sanding's been done. All these pieces are ready for stain and finishing. The moment of truth comes when it's time to stain. Any flaws in the millwork will show up. When it's done right, you end up with a finished product that's quite acceptable. Comparing the original to these pieces, got a nice match in the color and the texture and the wood grain itself. All that's needed is a couple coats of lacquer and this stuff will be ready to put up.